But the thing with communism is coming out of World War II is, think about the United States. It's like it's won World War II. It's the most powerful country in the world. It represents Western capitalism. But then the Soviet Union's also won World War II. They lost 20 million people. The United States lost 400,000. And then in 1949, Mao leads people in revolution in China. And suddenly 1/3 of the world is under some kind of communism. And this is where defeating communism becomes a high priority. I mean, it's one thing to attack it in 1940 when it's got this anti-war position. It's another thing to attack it in 1947 where it's actually an existential threat. Is Italy going to be communist? Is France going to be communist? Is Greece going to be a communist? All this is kind of forgotten now by many who look back at what the FBI was doing and think, well, it was just Hoover being paranoid. Well, he was actually carrying out the dictates of a larger political apparatus that wanted to keep its power. And that's where it got real heavy. I mean, the folk singers, by and large, didn't go to prison, but they were constrained on how they could work. But they always had this thing over them that they didn't even know about. A turn in a headline would have meant being rounded up and put away. And then, of course, with the party leaders themselves, they actually were put away. But then, that list, that security index stretches into the 60s. And not only on the Communist Party, but people like James Foreman, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, all these folks. I mean, the FBI is learning year in and year out, and including they get informants in place, through the 50s that are operating in the 60s. So that was part of my interest, too, because I focused a lot on the 60s. I discovered some of these informants, this guy Morris Childs in the Communist Party, but then I see his legacy goes back to like 1952. So it's kind of putting this big puzzle together. Yeah, I mean, it's a good detective story, but it's also more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, like you said something just now about, people don't really have a real conception of how, let's say, robust the FBI programs were. And I mean, in the book, the amount of information the FBI had on even just the internal dynamics of the party and like basically where possible choke points were or what like possible arguments they could exploit or just monitoring so many internal debates is really I mean I don't want to say impressive, but it is almost, it
certainly made an impression on me.
It gives you pause. If I can jump in, it's because there's this example. So the Communist Party in their they launched this white chauvinism campaign around 1949.
Yeah. And the famous white chauvinism campaign.
Yeah, they're trying to root out racism in the party, which, probably, right? There was probably, I mean, look, I'm sure people had some raw, ignorant thinking back then, and there was probably some of that in the party, but I don't think the party was like the big site and home of white chauvinism in U.S. society. Yeah. Thank you very much. Go to fucking Mississippi, excuse me, But they try to root it out, so they have this internal purge, and hundreds of people are kicked out. Some of the offenses are for serving a black comrade a cup of coffee with a chipped cup. There was perceived racism and stuff. I mean, there's a whole thing for me to get into this about some of the people they alienated, but for the sake of this example, in 1962, the FBI, basically drawing on the old white chauvinism campaign, circulated surreptitiously documents to the California Party accusing certain comrades of white chauvinism, and they actually lost an entire branch in Compton as a result. I mean, the FBI did this as part of its counterintelligence operation. So they're monitoring the internal politics, and they're using it against people, which it just says to me, you better have your internal house in order. and then, not be doing a bunch of stuff that, you probably don't need to be doing that way. There's other ways of addressing these things,
Aaron, I first read about the white chauvinism campaign, I think I've heard about it before, but really read about it about 5 years ago in that book, The Romance of American Communism, which also details an instance where someone served watermelon to a dinner party, and that was taken as a sort of a racial slight, which gotta say that's a very that takes a lot of setting up for that. I feel like you could have just been racist regularly. I don't know, but your description here, I mean, when I read that, I was like, well, that is absurd. But in the intervening years since I read that, in the past 5 years, it just struck me how many of these tactics are just it's repeated again and again and again. I mean, even in one part of your book, you talk about a woman in New York in this mixed race folk, these people who are getting ready to put on this concert. One of them is well, I don't think the Weavers should play because they're essentially he accuses them of doing cultural appropriation of black music. And this is to put it in perspective, this is when the party is basically nearing the height of repression towards it. And it strikes me as sort of very similar to a lot of the sort of squabbles you see today, where things are very bad, but people sort of just focus on this I mean, these people aren't even Maoists, for God's sake. They're democratic socialists or whatever, but they focus on this internal rectification. It's this spiritual purification where well, if I am able to sort of root out all of my nasty instincts and thoughts or whatever like that, then I'll be able to be this sort of perfect political figure, or at least I'll be happy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the metaphor is war. I mean, you don't want your army going into battle with one platoon fighting the other. I mean, that's essentially what these purges are like. But there's this, I quote Pettis Perry, who was an African-American comrade in the Communist Party, and he gives this blustery 1950 speech. I mean, if you ever read Stalin has simple sentences with absolute declarations, and Perry says, well, some comrades think now is not the time to fight white chauvinism. We need everybody we can get. And then Paris answers his question saying, well, yes, we do need everyone we can get, but we don't need white chauvinism. We need Marxism. 6 months later, he's in prison, for violating the Smith Act. Now is not the time. Do you need to address white chauvinism? Should you tolerate it? I mean, I would argue no. You shouldn't tolerate, but you should find the ways to help people who are just being ignorant through it, and people who are hostile. Well, you probably don't want to be hanging with those folks, but you don't have to.
Pretty easy to exploit as snitches and spies anyway.
Yeah. I mean, there's this guy, Harvey Matusow. He's this young guy.
That's how you pronounce it?
That's how I pronounce it.
My God, I've been calling him Harvey Matusow, but Matusow sounds actually like her name. I was like, damn. What is this guy, Hungarian or something?
Oh my God.
Yeah, I think that's actually the Matusow story is really, I found it, I had no idea about it, and I love reading about snitches. And
yeah, so Harvey Matusow's a snitch. You know how he ended up, right? Well, first off, Harvey Matusow's a trip. He would freelance as a clown. So there's a red flag for you right there. I mean,
Liz, do not listen to him. Liz used to do that. Liz used to do that. Do not listen to him, Liz.
Do not. He
only
listen
means
to
for guys.
Clowns, and he ended up later in life converting to Mormonism.
Now that's the real red flag.
But so Matusow gets out of the army. He starts working with the party. He hangs around people's songs. He's instrumental in literature distribution. He wins a contest selling the most daily worker subscriptions, and he wins an all-expense-paid trip to Puerto Rico, right? So the Communist Party has these gimmicks, but...
I mean, I'll be honest, I wish parties today still had those. I had to just go to the convention.
So, he's an up-and-comer, and he's got a certain position of respect, but it seems like the subscriptions probably is bullshit. He might have paid for them himself. But what happens is he's dating a woman in Harlem who works for the Amsterdam News, African-American woman, and he is caught up in the white chauvinism campaign because he has a day job of being a bill collector. So it said, look, you are, oppressing Black and Puerto Rican people by collecting bills. I mean, it's not a good job to have, and I don't recommend anybody get it, but this was what was used against Matusow, and it totally alienates him, to the point where he approaches the FBI to become an informant, which he does for a year. And then he's kicked out of the party because they become suspicious of him. And he goes on to testify in front of Congress, where he names Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Lee Hayes, Ronnie Gilbert, Fred Hellerman, Brownie McGee, everybody associated with the folk singers. And the minute your name goes on record in HUAC, they're taking notes and following up. If they don't have a file, it's going to be open, and they're going to pursue you. And once a file is open, it's very, very rare for that file to close. Well, it certainly never disappears, which is why I have a book, Files still exist. But so that's what Matusow does. He ends up, because he's a very peculiar character, he ends up having a moment of clarity. He regrets what he does. He writes a book, basically taking it all back. But, look, some things in life you can't undo. Matusow's legacy is he made life hell for... Pete Seeger spent almost 10 years facing prison because of Harvey Matusow. So
I did find it interesting.
Do that, don't do those kind of things. It's not good.
No matter how mad you are, I think snitching is sort of like, it's one of the lowest things you can do. And I've done a lot of low things, but that is, Christ, especially on people that they sent you to Puerto Rico, for God's sake. Someone sends me to Puerto Rico, I'm in the party for life. I'll tell you that.
Well, the thing with Matusow snitching, just for me to be very specific, these people weren't doing anything wrong. They were living their lives and they were politically associated. So for him to get up there and essentially brand them as some kind of criminals, that's actually the thing he shouldn't have done. So you gotta go down and join the union. You got to join it by yourself. Ain't nobody here can join it for you. You gotta go down and join the union by yourself. Sister's gotta go